Today, we're diving into a political ideology that's built for right now, not for the last century. It's an idea called Levnism, and it asks us to think about government in a totally new way, not as some old stone monument, but as a piece of software that can be constantly updated.
So let's start with the big question at the heart of it all. Think about it. What if a government could spot its own bugs, patch its own security holes, and just upgrade its entire operating system, kind of like the apps on your phone? Okay, so what is Levnism, really? Well, it all boils down to one powerful principle. Adaptation is the law of politics. The whole idea is that any system, whether it's political or economic, has to evolve, or it's going to collapse. It's a philosophy that says measurable results and hard data matter way more than tradition or what feels right.
So how does that actually work in the real world? Well, the first big piece of Levnism is building this idea of adaptation right into the DNA of the state itself. The goal is to create a government that's not just reacting to change, but is literally designed for it.
And the engine that keeps things moving is this thing called the 5-year adaptation cycle. It's mandatory. So imagine every single government agency has a public performance score. If that score drops below a certain point, boom, it automatically triggers a review. Failing projects don't get more money thrown at them. They get reformed or just plain replaced. The capital gets reallocated to what's actually working. The whole point is to kill off inefficiency before it can take root.
All right, so next up, let's see how this way of thinking shapes the economy. Levnism takes that same data-driven approach and applies it straight to the market. The aim is to build what it calls a self-correcting economy.
This quote from the source material really gets to the heart of why they think this is so important. The goal isn't just growth for growth's sake. It's about building resilience. The whole system is engineered to evolve faster than the crises that tend to knock traditional economies off their feet.
And this is done through something called the dynamic market system, or DMS. Just think of it as a kind of hybrid model. It's not the rigid, state-controlled system of old-school socialism, but it's not the total free-for-all of some capitalist models either. Instead, it's a system where key things, like taxes or support for certain industries, can automatically adjust based on real-time data. The idea is to head off problems before they become full-blown catastrophes.
Now, this is crucial. The government's role here is not to own the economy, but to be its architect. Its job is to build a framework where innovation can thrive, setting up the R&D networks, the digital infrastructure, and these innovation zones to spark new ideas. And just as important, its job is to know when to step back and let failing industries die instead of propping them up with subsidies forever.
And to make sure this innovation engine never runs out of fuel, Levnism has a hard rule. A minimum of 5 to 10% of the country's entire GDP has to be invested directly into science, R&D, and education. It's not a suggestion. It's a non-negotiable part of the whole system.
So you're pouring all this cash into technology and new ideas, which naturally leads to the next big question. How do you get your people ready for a world that's changing all the time? And that brings us to Levnism's take on education.
And right here you see a huge break from traditional systems. Instead of a social safety net that's all about cash handouts, which Levnism argues can create dependency, it proposes a system of empowerment. The focus isn't on giving people money to get by, it's on giving them the tools and the skills to adapt and create value for themselves.
And they do this through what's called a dynamic curriculum system. The national curriculum isn't some dusty old textbook. It gets updated every single year based on a real-time analysis of the job market. And then, every 5 to 10 years, the entire workforce goes through these huge, nationwide reskilling programs to make sure they stay ahead of the curve.
This leads to one of Levnism's most out-there policies, universal basic innovation. Forget universal basic income. In this system, every single citizen gets free access not to cash, but to the actual tools of creation. We're talking data, software, even access to labs. The stated goal here is to turn citizens from being passive consumers into active innovators.
So that brings us to our final pillar, a completely radical rethinking of national security. In a world of constant, rapid change, how does a Levinist state protect itself without falling back on old-school armies?
Well, the starting point is a flat-out rejection of the old ways. Levnism looks at conventional warfare, with massive armies and these long, drawn-out conflicts, and basically calls it a colossal failure of intelligence. It's seen as clumsy, inefficient, and totally obsolete.
So the Levinist arsenal looks completely different. The focus shifts entirely to tech superiority, total dominance in cyberspace, predictive AI that can neutralize threats before they even become conflicts, and automated defense systems. If force ever has to be used, it's got to be fast, precise, and limited. The traditional army, it's basically shrunk down to a symbolic role, or maybe for some rapid response stuff.
And this super pragmatic approach extends to how they deal with other countries. Forget permanent alliances based on shared ideology or ancient history. Levnism proposes these fluid circles of interest. You partner up with another nation based on data and what they bring to the table. Technical value, economic synergy. These partnerships are dynamic, not static, and they last exactly as long as they're useful, and not a moment longer.
This quote from the source material just perfectly captures that unsentimental, cold-blooded core of Levinist foreign policy. Loyalty isn't to other countries or to history. It's to the principle of constant, ruthless, pragmatic adaptation.
So, we've seen the vision, right? A government, an economy, and a military all running on data, all in a relentless pursuit of adaptation. But this sleek, optimized vision of the future, it does raise a pretty critical question. I mean, it is a compelling vision. A society that's always improving itself, guided by logic and evidence instead of old, rigid dogma. It's a civilization that's optimized for one thing above all else: survival and progress in a world that changes in the blink of an eye. But this leaves us with one final, and I think really provocative question. In a system that's so relentlessly optimized for efficiency, where every decision is guided by data, and every citizen is an asset to be constantly reskilled and redeployed, what's the ultimate price we pay? In a perfectly efficient state, what happens to human freedom?